Imagine waking up to silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind where the world is still asleep and everything is calm. This is the wrong kind of silence. The kind that sits on your chest before you even open your eyes. The birds have stopped singing. The market square outside your window, usually loud with carts and children and gossip, is empty. And somewhere beyond the walls, a horn has just sounded. By nightfall, more than 1,000 armed men will surround your home. Every road out is gone. Every option to run, gone. There is no back door. There is no one coming to save you, at least not today, and maybe not for months. Whatever happens next will happen inside these walls, and you will live through every single second of it, whether you want to or not. This is what it meant to be inside a medieval castle under siege. And here is what almost everyone gets wrong about it. We picture a siege like it's in the movies. One dramatic afternoon, swords clashing, a gate falling, and it's over. The truth is so much slower, so much crueler, so much stranger than that. Some sieges lasted for years. The people trapped inside didn't just fight, they starved. They watched each other get sick and die in ways no blade ever could. They made decisions that no human being should ever have to make, all just to see one more sunrise. By the end of this video, you are going to know exactly how a real siege unfolded, hour by hour, day by day, right down to the smallest, strangest details historians have uncovered. You'll find out what people really ate once the food ran out. And it is far stranger than you think. You'll learn the quiet, brutal psychological trick an attacking army used before they even fired a single stone. You'll hear what the walls actually sounded like from the inside as they were being destroyed. And you'll discover exactly what happened in the final, terrifying moments when those walls finally gave way. So here's the question I want you to sit with just for a second before we go back in time. If you were trapped inside those walls, with no way out and no way to know if help was coming, how long do you think you would have lasted? Let's find out. Before we get to the siege itself, you need to understand something most people never stop to think about. A castle was never just a fortress. It was a small, living, breathing city. Yes, there were knights. Yes, there were soldiers pacing the battlements with spears in hand. But behind those thick stone walls lived an entire world of ordinary people. Cooks, blacksmiths, servants, priests, laundresses, stable boys barely old enough to shave, children who had never held anything sharper than a butter knife, dozens, sometimes hundreds of people who had never trained for war a single day in their lives. And the moment that horn sounded, every single one of them became a target. So how did a castle even know an attack was coming? Sometimes the warning was loud and unmistakable. A messenger riding through the gates half dead from exhaustion, screaming that an army was 2 days out and closing fast. But often the first signs were quieter, smaller. A shepherd boy who went out to the fields that morning and simply never came back.
A thin line of smoke rising on the horizon, exactly where a village used to be. Silence, an eerie, unnatural silence, from a neighboring town that should have sent word by now and hadn't. And once that warning came, something remarkable happened. A castle that had spent years lost in quiet, ordinary routine transformed within hours. Livestock were dragged inside the walls in a panic. Every last chicken, every pig, every cow they could physically fit through the gate. Wells were checked and checked again, because clean water was about to become worth more than gold. Blacksmiths abandoned horseshoes mid-strike and started hammering out arrowheads by the hundreds, sparks flying long into the night. Grain sacks were hauled up into storerooms as fast as human arms could carry them, people running back and forth until their legs gave out. Even the children were handed jobs, hauling water, rolling bandages, anything to keep small hands busy and small minds distracted from what was coming. But here is the detail almost nobody talks about, the one resource that ran out faster than anyone ever expected, and it wasn't food, it was firewood. Think about it. Every fire needed for cooking, for boiling water safe enough to drink, for heating oil that would later be poured down onto attackers from the walls. All of it needed fuel, and a castle under siege could not exactly send someone strolling outside to chop down a tree. Historians have found that some sieges weren't lost because the walls fell. They were lost because the people inside simply got cold. They got sick. And slowly, quietly, they stopped being able to hold on. By the time the gates were finally sealed shut, and they were sealed often for the very last time in months, everyone inside understood the same terrifying, unspoken truth. Whatever they had managed to gather in those final frantic hours was all they were ever going to get. There would be no second trip to the market, no more deliveries, no more choices. And now, the enemy was about to arrive. What happened in those first moments of contact was almost more psychological than it was military, and it would decide the fate of everyone behind those walls before a single arrow was even fired. The first sign was never an arrow. It wasn't even a soldier. It was dust. A rising cloud on the horizon, growing thicker with every passing minute, until finally the shapes inside it became clear. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men, horses, and heavy wagons loaded down with timber and iron. From the top of the battlements, defenders stood frozen, watching their entire world shrink down to the small space inside these walls. And here's what's genuinely fascinating. The attacking army usually didn't come charging in swinging blades. They set up camp, calmly, methodically, almost lazily. Tents rose row by row. Cooking fires were lit as the sun went down. Horses were tied off and fed like this was any other evening. Why the leisurely pace? Because that slowness was the point. It was psychological warfare, and it started before a single weapon was ever raised. Watching an entire army settle in like it had absolutely nowhere else to be sent one unmistakable message to everyone trapped inside those walls. We are not going anywhere, and we are not in any hurry at all. Then came the herald. A single rider would approach under a flag of truce, stopping just outside arrow range, and call out the terms. Surrender now, and the Lord's family might be spared. The town might be left unburned. The garrison might walk away with their lives, refuse, and once the walls came down, no mercy would be shown to anyone inside.
This wasn't just a formality. It was a carefully calculated trap. Surrendering too quickly could brand a lord a coward for the rest of his life, a stain that would follow his family for generations. But refusing meant gambling every single life inside those walls on the hope that the stone would hold. And attacking commanders knew this perfectly well, so they used a tactic that was as simple as it was brutal. The very first offer was always the most generous, almost tempting, almost easy to accept. But every single day the defenders refused, the terms got worse. Fewer people would be spared, less mercy would be shown. Some commanders even set a literal deadline, spoken aloud in front of the entire garrison. Surrender before the first stone is thrown, and you live. Wait until we break through ourselves, and no one will be shown mercy. Not soldiers, not servants, not children. It was a countdown clock disguised as diplomacy. And it worked exactly as intended. Because now, everyone inside that castle wasn't only afraid of the army camped outside their walls.
And that is when the real machinery of medieval siege warfare rolled slowly, terrifyingly, into view.
This was the moment everyone inside the castle had been dreading. Because once the talking stopped, the machines came out, and nothing could have prepared the people inside for what these weapons actually felt like up close. Let's start with the one people fear most, even today, the trebuchet. Picture a wooden arm taller than a house, swinging with enough force to hurl a stone the weight of a small car through the air. When it launched, it didn't just make noise, it made the ground shake. Defenders standing on the walls described feeling the impact travel up through their feet before their eyes even registered what had hit. And commanders didn't stop at rocks. They hurled dead animals over the walls, diseased carcasses. In the most desperate sieges, even human remains, not always to kill directly, but to spread sickness and raw terror into a space where people had nowhere left to run. Then there was the battering ram. And no, it wasn't just a log on wheels. It was often housed inside a heavy covered shed, shielded from arrows and boiling oil, inching its way slowly toward the gate again and again and again. The sound alone was enough to break a person's spirit, a slow, deliberate, rhythmic boom, boom, boom. Each impact a reminder that the one door separating you from a screaming enemy was getting weaker with every strike. And then, the siege tower, a moving wooden fortress, sometimes several stories tall, rolled directly up against the castle walls so soldiers could climb straight onto the battlements, bypassing the gate, the moat, and every defense the castle had been built around entirely. Now, here's where most people have it completely wrong. Movies love to show stone walls exploding into rubble in seconds flat. In reality, breaching a well-built castle wall could take weeks, which meant the defenders weren't facing one terrifying moment. They were facing relentless, day after day, hour after hour psychological pressure. Every hour, another impact against the stone. Every single night, lying awake and wondering if this was finally the strike that would bring it all down. But the most underestimated weapon in any siege wasn't a machine at all. It was patience. Because while the trebuchets pounded away at the walls outside, something far quieter and far more dangerous was already spreading through the people trapped inside. This is the part of a siege you will almost never see in a movie, because it wasn't loud and it wasn't fast. It was slow, it was grinding, and honestly, it was far more terrifying than any battering ram. At first, life inside the walls tried desperately to hold on to something normal. Bread was still baked each morning. Prayers were still said at the chapel. Parents still knelt down and told their children that everything was going to be fine. But rationing began almost immediately, because no one, not the Lord, not the cook, not a single soul inside, knew if this siege would last 2 weeks or 2 long years. Meals shrank first, then they changed entirely. Horses, animals that had been prized, sometimes even loved like family, were the first to be eaten once the livestock ran low. Then came the truly desperate substitutes: boiled leather, tree bark, ground down into a rough, bitter flour, rats, hunted through the grain stores not as pests to be exterminated, but as protein, as the difference between one more day and none at all. And it wasn't only hunger that people feared, it was disease, cramped conditions, contaminated water, waste with nowhere left to go. Sickness spread through a besieged castle faster than any army outside could ever hope to break in. Many historians believe more people died from illness during long sieges than from actual combat. Sit with that for a moment. The enemy outside the walls didn't even need to breach them. All they had to do was wait. Morale itself became its own battlefield. Survivors described a specific, eerie kind of dread. The kind that comes from not knowing when the next attack would come, not knowing if anyone was riding to help, not knowing if today, of all days, was the day the walls would finally give out beneath them. That constant, low-grade fear wore people down in a way that no single battle ever could.
And here is the detail that still stops people cold today. In the most extreme, prolonged sieges recorded in medieval history, starvation pushed entire communities to the very edge of what a human being can endure. Trading, hiding, and rationing food in an atmosphere so thick with secrecy and suspicion that it turned neighbors against each other. Because when survival is truly on the line, fear doesn't only come from outside the walls. Sometimes, it comes from the person standing right next to you. But no matter how long the siege dragged on, no matter how many days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, eventually, something always had to give. And when it finally did, everything happened all at once. Every siege had a breaking point, and when it came, it rarely came the way anyone inside expected. Sometimes it was the walls themselves that failed first. Attackers would dig tunnels beneath the very foundations of the castle, a slow, brutal process known as mining, packing those tunnels with timber, then setting the wood ablaze to collapse the supports above. From inside, defenders felt it before they ever saw it. A deep, guttural rumble in the earth, followed by an entire section of wall that had stood for generations simply crumbling into a cloud of dust and stone. Other times, it wasn't the walls that broke, it was the people. Starvation, disease, and pure exhaustion could shatter a garrison's will long before any weapon ever did. A gate left unwatched for one crucial, fatal moment. A guard, so tired his hands were shaking, who simply couldn't hold his post a second longer. And then came escalade, soldiers swarming up ladders and towers directly onto the battlements, turning the very walkways defenders had patrolled for months into brutal, close-quarters slaughterhouses. Once the attackers were inside, everything a castle had been built to prevent happened all at once. The safety of stone walls, gone. The line between soldier and civilian, gone, in an instant. What followed was raw chaos, narrow stairwells and courtyards becoming desperate last stands, defenders falling back room by room, hallway by hallway, buying seconds and minutes for anyone who could still run or hide or pray. And here's the part that reveals just how calculated this entire brutal process really was. The fate of everyone inside the castle often came down to one single chilling factor: how the defenders had responded to that very first surrender offer, delivered so calmly, so quietly, back before a single stone was ever thrown. Commanders who had honored the terms of an early surrender were far more likely to show mercy when the fighting finally ended. But those who had refused, who had forced the attacking army to bleed for every single inch in time, money, and lives, often found the terms had turned exactly as harsh as they'd been warned they would. It is a chilling reminder of just how much power that one quiet conversation at the gate actually held over every single life inside. For the people who survived, whether through surrender, escape, or simple undeserved mercy, nothing about their world would ever look quite the same again. Which brings us to the question we still haven't answered. What actually happened after the walls came down? When a siege finally ended, the silence that followed was almost stranger than the chaos that had come before it. For a castle that had surrendered on honorable terms, life could return, slowly, painfully, unevenly, to something that resembled normal. Gates creaked open again, trade cautiously resumed. But the walls carried the scars for years afterward. Scorched stone, collapsed towers, and a community that had watched neighbors starve, fall sick, or die defending a home that, in the end, was never fully theirs to lose or to save. What's truly remarkable, when you step back and look at the whole picture, is this. The outcome of a siege was almost never decided by the strength of the stone. It was decided by the people trapped behind it, by how long they could endure fear, hunger, uncertainty, and the slow, grinding psychological weight of never knowing whether today was the day everything finally ended. So think back now to the question we asked at the very beginning of this video. If you were trapped inside those walls, no way out, and no way to know how long it would truly last, how long do you honestly think you would have lasted? Because for the people who lived through it, a siege was never really about castles or armies or even stone walls at all. It was about how much a human being can endure before something, finally, breaks. If this pulled you into medieval history the same way it pulled me in while researching it, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Because next time, we're stepping inside the walls of a very different kind of medieval life. And trust me, it's just as brutal in ways you would never expect.